It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. So you might agree with this statement if you fancy yourself a Machiavellian. Italian diplomat Niccolo Machiavelli lived over 5 centuries ago, but his influence among unscrupulous politicians reaches into the modern age. He is mostly known for writing a book called The Prince, the handbook that established him as the father of modern political theory. Through its teachings, power is the ultimate goal through any means necessary. Machiavelli was born in Florence on May 3, 1469, to Bernardo di Niccolo Machiavelli, a lawyer, and his wife Bartolomea di Stefano Nelli. He was the oldest son of his parents, with 2 elder sisters and a younger brother. The Machiavelli family was an established middle-class family, not particularly affluent, but they had means. Machiavelli was born during a tumultuous time in history, in which the popes waged war against the Italian city-states, and political alliances frequently changed, leading to the swift rise and fall of many short-lived governments. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire all battled for regional control and influence. He began his elementary education at the age of 7 and studied grammar, rhetoric, as well as Latin. Not much is known about Machiavelli's young life, aside from the fact that he was well versed in the ancient classics. Among these, he highly prized his copy of Livy's History of the Roman Republic. Machiavelli's first recorded involvement in the volatile Florentine political scene occurred in 1498, when he helped the political faction that deposed Girolamo Savonarola, who was the then dominant religious and political figure in Florence. In the same year, Machiavelli was appointed to the Second Chancery of the Republic. As Chancellor and Secretary to the Ten of Liberty and Peace, a sensitive government agency dealing chiefly with warfare and foreign affairs, Machiavelli participated in both domestic politics and in diplomatic missions to foreign governments. These posts allowed him many opportunities over the next 14 years, which allowed him to closely examine the inner workings of government. He also met many prominent individuals, among them Cesare Borgia, who furnished the young diplomat with the major profile of leadership for the prince. Machiavelli quickly gained political prominence and influence. By 1502, he was a well-respected assistant to the Republican head of state, Piero Soderini. In 1512, Spanish forces invaded Italy, and the Florentine political climate changed abruptly. The Medici family were the rulers of Florence for centuries, but in 1494 they were exiled, allowing for an autocratic regime to seize control. Machiavelli was purged from office, jailed, and then tortured for his well-known Republican sentiments. He was also finally banished to his country of residence in Percina. Machiavelli spent this time authoring the small body of political writings that sealed his place in history. Completed between 1513 and 1517, Discourses upon the first decade of T. Livius and The Prince were not published until after Machiavelli's death in 1531 and 1532 respectively. Around 1518, he turned from prose to drama in La Mandragola. Like the author's other writings, it is firmly predicated on an astute and unsentimental awareness that human nature is flawed and given to self-centeredness. The play was popular with audiences throughout much of Italy for several years. His next effort, a military treatise published in 1521 and entitled Libro della Arte della Guerra, The Art of War, was the only historical or political work published during the author's lifetime. Meanwhile, Machiavelli had made several attempts to gain favor with the Medici, including dedicating the prince to Lorenzo. In 1520, he was appointed official historian of Florence and was subsequently entrusted with minor governmental duties. His prodigious History of Florence carefully dilutes his Republican platform with the Medician bias expected of him. In 1525, Pope Clement VII recognized his achievement with a monetary stipend. 2 years later, the Medici were again ousted, and Machiavelli's hopes for advancement under the revived Republic were frustrated. This was because the new governments were suspicious of his ties to the Medici. Disheartened by his country's internal strife, Machiavelli fell gravely ill and died a disillusioned man, his dream of an operational republic unrealized. Critics have found it ironic that the fiercely republican Machiavelli should have written a handbook advising an autocratic leader how best to acquire and maintain power and security. Machiavelli was acutely aware, however, of foreign threats to Italian autonomy and thus deemed it necessary for a strong prince to thwart French and Spanish hegemony. Hence, the prince was addressed to the ruling Medici. He believed that a shrewd head of state, exemplified by Borgia, was essential to sublimating self-interest to common welfare. Since handbooks of conduct meeting monarchical needs had become immensely popular by the 1400s, the external form of the prince was neither startling nor particularly remarkable to Machiavelli's contemporaries. Yet, from its initial appearance, the prince proved no mere manual of protocol, nor, for even that matter, of even conventional strategy. In its chapters, Machiavelli delineated a typology of sovereignties and the deployment of available forces, military, political, or psychological, to acquire and retain them. The Prince is the first political treatise to divorce statecraft from ethics. As Machiavelli wrote, "How one lives is so far removed from how one ought to live that he who abandons what one does for what one ought to do learns rather his own ruin than his preservation." Adding to his unflinching realism the common Renaissance belief in humanity's capacity for determining its own destiny, Machiavelli posited two fundamentals necessary for effective political leadership: virtue and fortuna. Virtue refers to the prince's own abilities, ideally a combination of force and cunning. Fortuna to the unpredictable influence of fortune. In a significant departure from previous political thought, the designs of providence play no part in Machiavelli's scheme. On issues of leadership hitherto masked by other political theorists in vague diplomatic terms, Machiavelli presented his thesis in direct, candid, and often passionate speech. He employed easily grasped metaphors and structured the whole thing in an aphoristic vein which lends it a compelling authority. Reaction to the prince was initially, but only briefly, favourable, with Catherine de' Medici said to have enthusiastically included it, among other of Machiavelli's writings, in the educational curriculum of her children. But within a short time, the book fell into widespread disfavour, becoming viewed as a handbook for atheistic tyranny. The prince, and Machiavelli's other writings as well, were placed in the Papal Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. The prince was also held responsible for French political corruption and for widespread contribution to any number of political and moral vices. Gentilet's interpretation of the prince as advocating statecraft by ruthlessness and amoral duplicity was disseminated throughout Britain through the works of such popular and highly influential dramatists as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. In the prologue to Marlowe's The Jew of Malta from 1589, Machiavelli addresses the audience at length, at one point encapsulating the Elizabethan perception of Machiavelli by saying, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance." Here, and in the works of Marlowe's contemporaries, Machiavelli was depicted as an agent of all that Protestant England despised in Catholic High Renaissance Italy. Hostile English interpreters so effectively typified Machiavelli as an amalgam of various evils that the term Machiavellian is still used today. Rarely until the 19th century did mention of the prince elicit anything other than unfounded and largely unexamined repugnance. As Freddie Chiapelli has aptly summarized, centuries had to elapse before the distinction between moral moment and political moment, between technical approach and moralistic generalities, and even between the subject matter of the book and the author's person, were finally achieved. Modern critics, noting these crucial distinctions, have engaged in a prolonged and animated discussion concerning Machiavelli's true intent in The Prince. An anomalous 17th century commentator, philosopher Pierre Bayle, found it strange that there are so many people who believe that Machiavel teaches princes dangerous politics, for on the contrary, princes have taught Machiavel what he has written. Since Bayle's time, further analysis has prompted the most prolonged and animated discussion relating to the work, the true intent of its creator. Was the treatise, as Bayle suggested, a faithful representation of princely conduct which might justifiably incriminate its subjects but not its chronicler? Or had Machiavelli, in his manner of presentation, devised the volume as a vehicle for his own commentary? Still more calculatedly, had the author superseded description in ably providing a legacy for despots. A single conclusion concerning the author's motive has not been drawn, though patterns of conjecture have certainly appeared within Machiavelli's critical heritage. Lord Macaulay, in emphasizing the writer's republican zeal and those privations he suffered in its behalf, has contended that it is inconceivable that the martyr of freedom should have designedly acted as the apostle of tyranny. The peculiar immorality which has rendered the prince unpopular belonged rather to the age than to the man. Others have echoed this suggestion, examining the work in its historical context. John Addington Symonds has deemed it simply a handbook of princecraft, as that art was commonly received in Italy, where the principles of public morality had been translated into terms of material aggrandizement, glory, gain, and greatness. Many have urged that Machiavelli intended the treatise as a veiled satiric attack on the methods of Italian tyranny, or by abstruse methods, its converse. According to Harold J. Lasky, The Prince is a textbook for the House of Medici, set out in the terms their own history would make them appreciate it, and set out that its author might hope for their realization of his insights into the business of government. While ultimately unable to agree on the underlying purpose of The Prince, nearly all critics have nonetheless been persuaded of its masterful composition, even when unwilling to endorse its principles. Macaulay has affirmed that the judicious and candid mind of Machiavelli shows itself in his luminous, manly, and polished language. And Francesco de Sanctis has determined that, where he was quite unconscious of form, he was a master of form. Without looking for Italian prose, he found it. For sheer volume and intensity, studies of the Prince have far exceeded those directed at Machiavelli's Discourses. However, the latter work has been acknowledged as an essential companion piece to the former. All of the author's subsequent studies treating history, political science, and military theory stem from this dissertation that contains the most original thought of Machiavelli. Less flamboyant than The Prince and narrower in its margin for interpretation, the Discourses contains Machiavelli's undisguised admiration for ancient governmental forms and his most elegant, thoroughly explicated republicanism. Commentators have noted the presence of a gravity and skillful rhetoric that at times punctuate The Prince, but are in full evidence only in that work's final chapter, a memorable exhortation to the Medicis to resist foreign tyranny. The Discourses also presents that methodical extrapolation of political theory from historical documentation which is intermittent in The Prince. Max Lerner has observed that if The Prince is great because it gives us the grammar of power for a government, the Discourses are great because they give us the philosophy of organic unity, not in a government, but in a state, and the conditions under which alone a culture can survive. It has been deemed not at all incongruous that an intellect immersed in historical circumstance and political impetus should so naturally embrace comedy as well. For Machiavelli regarded comedy exactly as he conceived history, an interplay of forces leading unavoidably to a given result. Machiavelli's Mandragola, his only work in the comedic genre, clearly reflected this parallel. De Sanctis has remarked that under the frivolous surface of Mandragola are hidden the profoundest complexities of the inner life, and the action is propelled by spiritual forces as inevitable as fate. It is enough to know the characters to guess the end. The drama scenario concerns Callimacho's desire to bed Lucretia, the beautiful young wife of a doddering fool. Masquerading as a doctor, Callimacho advises the husband Nicaea to administer a potion of mandrake to Lucretia to render her fertile. He also warns that the drug could have fatal implications for the first man to have intercourse with her. He slyly suggests to Nicaea that a dupe be found for this purpose. Persuaded by her confessor, a knavish cleric, to comply with her husband's wishes, the virtuous Lucretia at last allows Callimacho into her bed, where he has no difficulty convincing her to accept him as her lover on a more permanent basis. Tales of this sort were already commonplace throughout Europe by the Middle Ages, though critics have remarked that Machiavelli lent freshness to even this hackneyed material. Sidney Anglo has commended his clear, crisp repartee and his ability to nudge our ribs at improprieties and double meanings, despite characterization that is rudimentary, haphazard, and inconsistent, with even protagonists going through their motions like automata. Macaulay, on the other hand, has applauded the play's correct and vigorous delineation of human nature. A decided influence on the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and Sir Francis Bacon, and on the thought of such modern political theorists as Vilfredo Pareto, Machiavelli has been called the founder of empirical political science, primarily on the strength of the Discourses and the Prince. Taken in historical perspective, it is understandable that the Prince should have dwarfed Machiavelli's other works. For with this slim treatise, the author confronted the ramifications of power when its procurement and exercise were notably peremptory. Commentators have come to weigh the integrity of Machiavelli's controversial thought against the pressing political conditions which formed it. Some, like Roberto Rodolfi, have endeavored through their studies to dislodge the long-standing perception of Machiavelli as a ruthless character, stating, "In judging Machiavelli, one must take account of his anguished despair of virtue and his tragic sense of evil. On the basis of sentences taken out of context and of outward appearances, he was judged a cold and cynical man, a sneerer at religion and virtue. But in fact, there is hardly a page of his writing, and certainly no action of life, that does not show him to be passionate, generous, ardent, and basically religious." Peter Bondinella has stated in European Writers, Machiavelli created a new religion out of politics with all its fateful implications for modern intellectual history. In 1502, Machiavelli married Marietta Corsini. The couple had 6 children together, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince is one of the most celebrated and notorious books in the history of Western political thought. Most celebrated and notorious books in the history of Western political thought. It continues to influence discussions of war and peace, the nature of politics, and the relation of private ethics to public duties. Ostensibly a 16th century manual of instruction on certain aspects of princely rule and behavior, The Prince anticipates and complicates modern political and philosophical questions. What is the right order of society? Can Western politics still be the model for progress toward peace and prosperity, or does our freedom to create our individual purposes and pursuits undermine our public responsibilities? Are the characters of our politics markedly different, for better or for worse, than the politics of earlier eras? Machiavelli argues that there is no ideal, transcendent order to which one can conform, and that the right order is merely the one that has the capacity to persist over time. The Prince's emphasis on the importance of an effective truth over any abstract ideal marks it as one of the first works of modern political philosophy. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of Biographics. If you did, there's a couple of things you could do right now. One is hit that like button below. Also, if you want more stuff like this, we put out brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday, so hit that subscribe button below. And subscribe button doesn't do what it used to on YouTube. If you actually want to get a notification about these videos, please do hit that bell button next to the subscribe button, and that'll send you a notification every time, every Monday and Thursday when we put out a new video. Also, if you want to watch something else right now, stuff from the archive, over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.